be with you all in Tacoma. And that's not just because I haven't been anywhere in 11 months, but because even after seeing 70 different countries in this world, there's no place I'd rather be than in the Pacific Northwest. We are going to talk about the challenges in foreign policy that Joe Biden faces as president. And we will leave a lot of time for comments and questions and answers. You already know that Biden became president at a time when he's facing 4 big interlocking domestic crises: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis of racial disparity, and a large group of Americans who have been vaccinated against belief in science or in facts. And yet, the world doesn't stop just because the US is having a crisis. So he has to step up at the same time and deal with foreign policy challenges that have been made more difficult by the last 4 years. We've had under the Trump administration a very consistent policy of alienating our allies and embracing authoritarian leaders. The US went largely silent on its traditional role of speaking out for human rights and democracy around the world. And we damaged the credibility of the United States, the confidence that other countries and other people around the world would have that the US would stick by what it says. And as a consequence of all these, for really the first time in 75 years, there was more talk than ever about the US no longer being the leader of the free world. This is the hand that Joe Biden was dealt. And today, in a speech at the Department of State, and there will be a link to the text of the speech in the chat, he laid out where he wants to lead American foreign policy. I know that some critics will say that the speech was short on specifics and long on platitudes, and there's some truth to that. But in fact, the speech represents a genuine turning point in American foreign policy. And I don't say that only because of the very kind words he said about the professionals at the State Department, the civil service, and the Foreign Service. That means a lot to me when he said that they will have the respect, the support, and the empowerment from the White House, and that he will have their back. That makes a big difference in the confidence with which the US acts in the world. But the president's central message for the American people was that there's no longer a bright line dividing domestic policy and foreign policy. In fact, they have to be consistent with each other and reinforce each other. He called upon all the professionals in the State Department to always have in mind something that I tried to have in mind, but maybe not as much as Biden wants us to, which is not just that we work for the American people, but that everything we do in foreign policy should be prefaced with the question, how does this benefit ordinary middle-class Americans? How does it reflect their values? How does it promote their security, their prosperity? And how does it enable them to stand taller and prouder in front of the world community? I think that the president understands that the stability, the security, the prosperity of every country and of the world depends crucially on the relationship of governments to their citizens and on the relationships among citizens. And that our credibility as a nation, when we speak to the rest of the world, depends upon consistency, or at least acknowledging the places in which our own policy is not fully consistent. If I could extrapolate a little bit on what the president was saying, I would put it like this. We can't advocate for religious freedom around the world when we have a visa policy that bans adherents of one particular religion. We can't demand respect for human dignity from other countries when we have a border policy that dehumanizes people coming to the United States. We can't insist on human dignity if we prevent people from serving in our military because of their sexual orientation. We can't help other countries to reform their economy or reform their justice system if our economic system widens income inequality and our justice system increases racial disparity. And I think that this is what you will see in the president's domestic policy as well, in an effort to make our leadership and our priorities with other countries consistent with what we're trying to do at home. The president also, of course, emphasized the importance of alliances. Our alliance with the leading democratic countries around the world, in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, is a force multiplier. It is our greatest asset in international relations. And for the last 4 years, we pissed away that asset. There's no other way to put it. So the president talked about rebuilding muscle memory, about counteracting the atrophy of alliance muscle that came about through neglect and abuse. He also talked about multilateralism, a word that was banished from American diplomatic vocabulary for the last few years. There are things that the US can do by itself or with a few partners, but the hardest questions we have, global health, global climate, nuclear proliferation, can only be dealt with if we get most, if not all, countries of the world working in the same direction. The president made a couple of other specific announcements, specifically saying the US will no longer support offensive military operations by Saudi Arabia in the terrible war in Yemen, which is right now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. He has put a pause on President Trump's order to withdraw US forces from Germany. But other than that, there were not that many specifics. And I think you'll hear some criticism of his speech for that. But it does impress me as not just a change in tone, a change in rhetoric, but as a determination, not simply to put the United States back into very traditional foreign policy postures, but to really look towards a future where solutions of global problems are possible if the US is true to its own value and is willing to engage with other countries. I also feel confident because of the outstanding team that he's assembled. I think it is a good mixture of people who have been active politically, helped and advised him on his campaign, people who are coming back after leaving the Trump administration, and very importantly, keeping faith, as the president said he would, with those who suffered for the last 4 years under Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Tillerson, and making sure they're well represented in the leadership. It's a team that has deep experience, but it's also a team that has enough fresh faces that I think they will come up with some innovative answers to some of the hardest problems. Let me sketch just a few of the hardest problems, and then we can go anywhere else in the conversation you'd like. The most important relationship the United States will have this century is with the People's Republic of China. The China-US story will be the story of the 21st century in the same way that the Cold War was the story of the 20th century. For the last several administrations, it's often been said that we view China always as a competitor, often as a rival, but we hope never as an enemy. That's a good slogan, and it's one that I hope can be realized. But I'll give the Trump administration a little bit of credit for recognizing that China does not have a mirror image view of the United States. Rather, there is a belief in China that it borders on religious conviction of the ascendancy of China in international affairs, economically, militarily, politically, and of, pardon me, of the inevitability of China surpassing the United States in all of these categories. It's also distressing that China more and more talks with the kind of arrogance that used to be the special province of only American and Soviet diplomats. And I think that does not work to their advantage. The US has so many assets that I do not take for granted that China will realize all of its ambitions. First of all, allies. Nobody actually wants to be an ally with China. Their only ally is North Korea, and that's not because they got the last pick in the draft. It's because they are not as trusted as the United States, even at this point in time, to have the interests of allies in their heart. We have important advantages in science and in innovation. We have very difficult military choices to make about how to defend not so much the United States, but key United States allies against potential military intervention from China. But I think what is often overlooked is that perhaps the most important competition between the US and China will be in cyberspace. We have not come close in the United States to achieving the paradisical vision of the internet liberating individuals and of making a more true democracy by sharing information. I don't have to recount all the ways in which social media and the internet have been so successful in spreading disinformation and misunderstanding. But it's still a very different vision and a very different situation from China's goal of a dystopian world in which the internet is under strong government control and becomes a means of government control of citizens. It's a project that China is devoting its best minds and a lot of money to, and it has implications not just for Chinese citizens, not just for China's neighbors, but for the US as well. A couple of words about Russia. Russia is not as big a challenge as China, but it is a more dangerous challenge than China for our security as a nation. And that's because there are just two ways left in which Russia is still a global superpower. And those two ways are creative computer programming skills and nuclear weapons. I'll come back to nuclear weapons in a moment, but we don't have the option of doing what we pretty much tried to do in the 1990s and early 2000s of de-emphasizing Russia because it was a power that was declining in terms of military, economically, and demographically. For reasons that have to do with Mr. Putin's own sense of how he keeps control, We face a Russia that is, I would say, cautiously aggressive, and that requires us to think carefully about how to defend ourselves and our allies and how to respond to each challenge from Russia. Still, I think there's some hope. The paradox of the Donald Trump era in the White House is that Mr. Trump could never bring himself to say a negative word about Mr. Putin or about Russia. And yet, in a number of ways, there were tough sanctions on Russia. There were poor economic ties. And there was no progress on the issues Russia cares about. So there's a certain amount of nostalgia for Trump already in Moscow, but there is also a recognition. And I spent this morning on a call like this with about 50 old farts, that is retired diplomats and generals from the US and Russia, talking about what comes next. There's a recognition that at least with the Biden administration, you may not get as much loving embrace. You will get a lot of criticism, but you can actually do business. And the good business that has already been done is the extension of the New START Treaty, which was the last treaty restricting the size of the US and Russian arsenals. It would have expired tomorrow if it had not been renewed by Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin. The Trump administration incorrectly thought that extension would lead to the US having some leverage over Russia. That was never a smart idea. And so I'm very glad, because it's an issue I've worked on a lot the last 4 years, that the US government simply did the right thing and extended the treaty. Now comes the hard part, but also the hopeful part, which is a sustained dialogue about strategic security between the United States and Russia. That means constant meetings and discussions, not just about a specific proposal, but about the entire range of threats that we pose to each other, how we can reduce arsenals, reduce the potential missions of nuclear weapons, and above all, reduce the risk that we stumble or blunder into a nuclear confrontation. The US and Russia each have sufficient arsenals, if fully unleashed, to literally end human existence on this planet. A different nuclear issue that I'll mention just for a moment, and we can go into if you'd like, is the Iran nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. I didn't have anything to do with negotiation of that deal, but I had a lot to do with implementation. And I can tell you that it met its purpose. It provided a means of ascertaining that Iran could not move forward towards a nuclear weapon without the world and the US being fully aware of it. When President Trump pulled out of the agreement, we're now in a situation where Iranian stockpiles of enriched uranium bring them closer to having the necessary amount to construct one nuclear weapon. And it's also led to an increased risk of military conflict in the Middle East. It makes sense to get back to the deal. And it looks kind of simple. President Biden says, we want to return to compliance if you return to compliance. The Iranians say, we will return to compliance if you return to compliance. And now we have a little spitting contest about who will go first. And it's a contest that is made more difficult by the strong political divisions, both in Washington and in Tehran. In a more normal diplomatic environment, you would sit down quietly and you'd work out, you're going to do A and we're going to do 1, and then you'll do B, and then we'll do 2 and 3. It's not an insoluble problem, but time is limited. and the political atmosphere in both countries is going to make this hard to get back to. I'm still optimistic about the basic logic that we have two presidents who want to get back to the deal, who are not afraid to engage with the other side. So I have a little bit of hope on that. On other nuclear issues, which is my focus these days, the president has some tough choices to make. I am hopeful that as president, he will enunciate a policy that he supported when he was vice president, which is to declare a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. In other words, to say that the only reason we have a nuclear arsenal is to prevent other countries from using their nuclear arsenal. And there is no other purpose or warfighting aim that for which we would use nuclear weapons. It would be a pretty dramatic change. It would be, of course, opposed by many in the Congress and in the military-industrial complex, but it offers the potential for a genuine change towards a more stable world in which the use of nuclear weapons is less likely. The president also has to make big foreign policy decisions in the budget that he will soon submit to Congress. And that is true particularly of the military budget, and again, my special focus of the nuclear weapons budget. The US is committed to spending about $1.7 trillion. I don't know how many of you have ever counted up to $1 trillion, but it's a really big number. It's $50 billion a year for the next 30 years to upgrade the submarines, missiles, and bombers that carry American nuclear weapons, as well as keeping the nuclear weapons themselves functional. $50 billion a year, by the way, is only a tiny bit less than what we spend on diplomacy and humanitarian aid every year. The president has to make some choices that will have big effects on our security posture. And I don't know whether to predict that he will slow down some of the nuclear spending. Last point, obviously, military and decisions on military use are an important part of foreign policy. And one of the few things, again, that I would give some credit to the Trump administration for is that Trump appeared to have a real reluctance to intervene militarily in other countries. And that's not a bad instinct to have. The foreign policy community, the kinds of people who get appointed to high positions, especially in a Republican administration, often are hawkish and see military intervention as a first resort instead of a last resort. George Bush did not resist that. President Obama only partly successfully resisted that. Trump did resist it, and I give him credit for that. And I hope that there will be a similar mindset from President Biden. So that's what I've got to say. I think John and somebody else are going to help moderate questions. If you put questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A